Hey, this is Martin Brennand from Imagineer Systems, and today we're going to be looking at how to use Mocha version 3's camera solver with Video Copilot's amazing Element plugin. Now, if you haven't checked out Element 3D before, you can go to Video Copilot's website at videocopilot.net and check it out under the products page. The Element 3D plugin lets you insert 3D objects into After Effects shots using a really great custom interface and a really nicely designed render engine. So this lets you bring in things like OBJ files and Cinema 4D files, and then it lights it and shades it according to your design. You can even use After Effects lights in your own shot to help light the 3D model in the scene. And it also inherits all the usual After Effects properties like motion blur and so on. So we're going to use Mocha's camera solver to drive a 3D element in the shot and attach it to a moving person's head. So let's get started. Okay, so here we are inside After Effects, and I'm going to attach a horn to the side of this guy's head, just for the heck of it. So what we need to do first is actually track our scene inside Mocha, and then bring the data back in to drive the element shot. So let's do that now. Okay, so here we are inside Mocha Pro. We could easily do this also in Mocha for After Effects version 3, but you need version 3 of either Mocha Pro or After Effects to do this shot. So first of all, we're going to track the shot so we can get some camera data for the scene. So I'm going to begin by just drawing a large shape down on the ground here, just to grab this whole area down here. I'm going to turn on my perspective data here, I'm going to get the surface and pull that down just so I can see how that's going to run as I track. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it just helps us get a little bit of an idea of how that's tracking. And then I'm going to come down to my settings and set minimum percentage of pixels used to about 90, just so we're as accurate as possible. And I'm going to set perspective on so we get that perspective shift that's in the shot. I'm also going to call my layer here ground track. Always good to label your layers. And then we can begin tracking. So I'm just going to start tracking forwards. And this will track through the shot quite successfully. So I paused the recording just to let that finish tracking so you didn't have to watch that. So now we can take a look at the shot. So we can see that's following on and holding on to the track quite nicely. So we'll just stop that. And we can scrub through and just check to make sure it's all locked on. And that's looking pretty good. So now this shot in particular, it looks like it's just a pan tilt zoom, but it is a handheld shot, so just to be sure, I'm going to also track the back wall, just to make sure we get any subtle hand maneuvers that may be happening in the shot. So we're going to draw another shape now on the wall here, to make sure that we accurately define the scene in question. So I'm just going to zoom out a little bit, and I'm going to come in here and draw a fairly large shape through there. And again, with our surface data, I'm just going to pull my surface corner up and move it into a perspective of the wall. And again, I'm not being super accurate, but again, it'll just help me line it up a little bit better. And once again, we're going to do the same thing. So I'm going to turn it to 90% pixels in the minimum percentage of pixels, and I'm going to set it to perspective. Now I'm going to name this one wall track. And for some reason my caps lock's on. Let's try that again. Wall track. And I'm going to turn off the track for the ground because we don't want to track that anymore. So I'm going to click back on my wall track and start tracking. And once again, I'm going to pause this so you don't have to watch. Okay, so that's finished tracking now. And we're going to just check to see how that's looking. So let's just drag through the timeline. And that's looking pretty solid as well. Another technique you can use to make sure if your track is going well is we can click this stabilize button up here, and then that will just move the footage around our tracking data to see if it's locking on. So I can find a nice point like on the grid here, and we can see that's holding on. We can see over here that these grids are really locking down quite nicely and it's not moving around. So that suggests it's quite a good track. So now we can turn that off. So I'm going to stop the track and turn off my stabilize button. And now we have two layers in the scene that we can use to solve our camera. Okay, so now we have these two layers, we can now use them to solve the camera. So I'm just going to select them both and move over to the Camera Solve tab. Now by default it's set to auto, and we could use that one to let it try and go through a few different solvers to guess the type of camera. But in this case, because we have that little bit of camera movement in there and we know it's a handheld, I'm going to choose small parallax instead. and we can just click Solve. So now what it's doing is going through the small parallax solver to work out the scene defined by these two tracked layers. So it's working out those planes. And then once we have our shot, and we can see here it's a solve quality of 90%, we could go ahead and export the camera data. But in this case, I'm not going to do that because I want to do an extra step to get the data I need for our shot. So let's do that now. So, because we specifically want to attach a horn to the side of this guy's head, we need to track the side of his head to and then export the data relative to the camera we just solved. And how do we do that? It's quite easy. We just literally draw a shape and track it like any other shape. So I'm going to go back to my track tab and click the draw tool again. And I'm just going to draw a shape around the side of his head here. And I'm going to define where the surface is going to go. So I'm just going to set it down here. Now the reason I'm doing this is now you don't normally have to set a surface like this because you can just use it the way that you want it for a corner pin, for example. But when we do a camera solve, we use these surface points to define where the nulls are going to go. And this is going to be important for this moving head here, because we want to be able to define where the model is going to sit on the guy's head. So I'm going to sit it about here. I may move it over just a little bit, so I'm just going to hold down the W key and move the whole surface over, just so it sits about here on his head. And I'm going to get an approximate perspective on the side of his skull here. So we're going to call this one here head track. And I'm going to start tracking this one using the same method we used before. So I'm going to set that to 90 and perspective, and we can begin tracking. So this will track a lot quicker because we're using a smaller area, but we've got a lot of nice texture detail here in the hair, and there's obviously the side of the head being planar here. We'll get a nice solid track. Okay, so we've stopped that again just so that you don't have to watch the whole track, and we can see the final result here. So we can see that's sitting quite nicely on the side of his head there. And now we can use this tracking information to export out to After Effects. So the great thing is that because we've done our camera solve for the scene that's not moving, we've tracked for the static areas and defined the camera for the static areas, we can now just select our layer for the head track and immediately export. We don't have to solve the camera again. So because we want to work with After Effects, I'm going to hit just copy to clipboard. We could just use FBX if we're going out to another 3D format, but here we're using After Effects, so copy to clipboard it is. So let's click copy to clipboard, and it's solved that now, and we can move over to After Effects. Okay, so here we are inside After Effects. All we need to do is come up to our edit menu now and choose Paste Mocha Camera to bring in our camera data. Now this option here will only exist if you've installed the Mocha 3D Importer plugin, which is available from our website. So I'm just going to select that, and it will bring in both our nulls and our camera data here in the shot. Now these nulls are a little bit big, so I'm just going to hit S for scale, and I'm going to select all of my nulls here, and I'm just going to bring them down to about, let's say, 50%. Just so they're a little bit smaller in our shot. So now we can go through and have a look at that, and we can see how those nulls are nicely locking to the side of his head. If I select them all, we'll also be able to see the orientation of those nulls in the shot with all of its motion data intact. Okay, and now that is the nice, easy, trackable, technical part done. Now we can start the fun part and use the element tool to bring in our 3D models. So we start an element plugin by creating a new solid. So I'm going to go new, solid, and I'll bring in that. So I'm just going to call this literally element because that's what we're going to be using. And I'm going to click OK. So it brings up a nice white solid, and then we're going to come down to Effect, Video Copilot, Element. And this will create the element in the shot. So we can see here it's quite a few different settings, and I won't go into all of them today. But in order for us to bring in our 3D model, we need to go to Scene Setup. So we just click on this button, and I'll bring over my interface, which is on my other screen, and I'm just going to expand that to full. Now, I won't go through all of the settings here today. If you want to know more about the entire workflow, you can check out videocopilot.net's great comprehensive tutorials on this. But I'll just take you through the basics right now. So here we've got a whole bunch of primitives that we can use in the model browser over here. And we could use one of those if we wanted to, but I've actually created my own inside Cinema 4D, so I'm going to come up to Import, and I'm going to choose an OBJ file, which is this horn, and import it into the shot. So you can see here we've got a very unlit horn here at the moment, because I've got to change a few settings just to get it going. So I'm going to turn on an environment for this horn so we can have a look at it, and I'm going to do auto normals on it so we can get that correct lighting in the shot. Now, I'm not going to do too much to this at this stage, I just want to get it in and position it first. So for now, I'm going to leave it at this nice, easy, basic default white. So I'm going to click OK. And at the moment you can't see it in the shot because it's probably hiding somewhere without this camera. So if I turn off my camera for a second, you can see it there. But because I've got a camera set in the shot, it's hiding somewhere else. So we need to bring that model into where we want to have it. So I'm going to come to my group settings, and I'm going to set up the particle replicator. And the particle replicator has a position XY and a particle count of 1. When it has a particle count of 1, it just shows the one model that you've brought in this case our horn. So firstly, I want to set the X, Y, and Z positions to match where it is on his head. So to do that, I'm going to choose my mocha null 4, which is the center null of this surface configuration, and I'm going to press P to bring up my position, and I'm also going to scroll down into Effects in the Element plugin and come to the Groups and the Particle Replicator just to find those Position XY settings. So let's just drag that up for the time being so we can see what we're doing. And I'm going to Alt-click Position XY, and I'm going to drag that down to the position of mocha null 4. So what this will do is because there's only 2 values here in the position XY, but there are 3 values in mocha null 4, it'll just grab the first 2, which is exactly what we want. So once we've gone that, I'm just going to click out of that. And then finally, we need to set the Z value. So for that, I'm going to, again, press Alt-click on position Z. And in this case, I'm going to pick whip and drag just down to the Z position of mocha null 4. So rather than holding on the position area, I'm going to hold over the Z position area, like that. And now we can see our horn in the shot. So I'm going to come back out here. Now, obviously, at the moment, if I drag through, you can see that it's kind of sitting on the side of his head like some kind of weird sideburn, so we want to make sure that it's rotated around the right way. So the way we can do that is, let's have a look at our middle null here. So I'm going to select my mocha null 4, and we can see how that null is pointing straight out at us because it's aligned correctly to the surface of his skull. So again, we can use the rotational values of this null to align correctly the rotation of this horn. So I'm going to hold down the R key, and that will bring up our X rotation here, and we can see how that's moving through the shot. So we only really care about the initial orientation of this in particular, so I'm going to just come back to my first frame and copy these values and paste them into the rotation of the first horn part. So I'm going to scroll down my element again, and I'm going to find rotation, which is here. So let's just move that up a little bit. So we've got XYZ like we've got XYZ here. So I'm just going to copy that one and paste it to that one. And the same for this one, copy and paste, and copy and paste. So there are our initial values, so let's just see what that's done. So that's rotated it around, and it's still moving correctly, but we can see obviously that the model orientation is still not quite right. So let's fix that now. Okay, so we're going to change this orientation by actually going back into our scene setup and adjusting some of the model properties of this horn. So I'm going to go back over to scene setup in Element, and that will pull up our nice interface again. And I'm just going to click on the horn section up here so we pull up the transform. Now I've already defined an anchor point in this model when I made it in Cinema 4D, and at the moment horn defaults to the anchor point at the model center. So what I want to do is actually change that to from model. So now that's going to take the axis point that I set, which is at the bottom part of this horn here. So it's going to sit more correctly in the scene. Now we also want to rotate it around correctly, so at the moment this is facing up, and now I modeled this quite differently, so I want to make sure that it's sitting the right way, so I'm going to rotate it around to about 270. Now you may have to play with these settings, but I know for a fact that I need to rotate it around this much, so you can play around with that to get that looking correct. So I'm just going to click OK. And now we can see that horn is actually sitting correctly on top of his head. So we might want to rotate it around a little bit, but we're starting to get a really nice sitting on top of his skull here. So let's just do a couple of tweaks here and we'll rotate that around. So I'm going to come down again to my particle replicator rotation, and I'm going to grab the Z-axis, and we can see that's rotating around the center point there, so I'm just going to move that around to about there. Now because it's rotated in the replicator around a little bit, I want to sort of make sure that that's still flat on his skull, so I'm going to adjust the X just a little bit, and let's bring that Z around a little bit further too. So, and I'll tweak a little bit of the Y, so we're just trying to get it nice and sitting and having this arc over a little bit, just like a bull's horn. So now when we play that back, we can see that's sitting right really nicely, and it's just arcing a little bit forwards. So now we can play with a little bit with the lighting. So that wraps up part 1 of using the camera solver in Mocha version 3 with Video Copilot's Element 3D. In part 2 we'll look at lighting, rendering and shading of the horn, along with compositing it into the shot to make it look a little bit more realistic. For more information about Mocha version 3, check out our website at imagineersystems.com. If you have any questions you can ask on the forum at forum.imagineersystems.com, or you can check out Facebook at facebook.com/imagineersystems.